It all started because I wanted to be a good person. I'd taken some old things of mine, stuff from my parents' house I had shoved into the back of my closet, and donated them to Habitsville local secondhand shop. I figured someone else could use my threadbare Habitsville High t-shirt more than I was at the time. What I didn't intend, however, was to give away Bob. This next bit is a little embarrassing. Bob is a small, pink, stuffed bear with a little jingle inside his stomach. I've had him since I was a baby, and although I've outgrown such childish things, Bob is sacred. That's why, heart sinking, I retraced my steps last Thursday back to the secondhand store where I was sure Bob had accidentally slipped into one of the donation boxes. It took some coaxing, but an employee eventually informed me that Bob had already been purchased. A tingle of silly grief swept through me, but then I was given hope. Bob had been bought by Nora Vandeveld, owner and chief proprietor, along with her two sisters, of Narrow Street Antiques, right here in Habitsville. A quaint little bell chimed when I entered the shop. The musty smell of decay and history hugged my nostrils, not in an unpleasant way. The shop was crowded, but not with people. The sheer amount of things, even just in the foyer, was insane. Books were stacked higher than my head, their spines peeling with age. Knickknacks and figurines covered every surface, and I suddenly became hyper-aware of my limbs. I made my way inside carefully. At the front desk were three women, the Vandeveld sisters. Two were seated in rocking chairs on either side of the counter, their eyes dark under their cloth hats, knitting slowly from a single ball of yarn in a centered basket. It was impossible to tell what they were making, something large and dark. In the center, standing perfectly still, was Nora Vandeveld. She had wild gray hair and a lined face, with sharp eyes that looked onto me as soon as I entered. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice a cold and unconcerned rasp. "Welcome to Narrow Street Antiques. Can I help you find anything?" I took a few steps towards her, already unreasonably nervous. "Yeah, I'm looking for a specific item I was told you purchased from the secondhand store a few days ago. It's a small, stuffed bear. Giggles, pink," I asked hopefully. She smiled, her aged lips curling upward so slowly I thought they might creak. "Oh yes, we've put that particular item onto our shelves. He's around here somewhere." Her grin widened and I subconsciously took one step back. "Why don't you go find him?" I gazed over my shoulder. There was a ton of stuff in here. I mean, sure, but judging from the shoddy exterior of the building, this place wasn't that big. I'm not one to complain about customer service, so I just nodded. "Okay, thank you." I turned heel and headed into the opening between the stacks of books. "Good luck. Just make your way back up to the counter once you find Bob." I nodded before entering the slim aisle. By the time I realized I had never actually told Nora Bob's name, I couldn't see the front counter anymore. My first hour or so, at least what felt like an hour, went smoothly. My eyes were peeled for any sign of my stuffed friend, and as I weaved through tall wooden cabinets lined with figurines and racks of sweaters from the 1980s, I actually found myself enjoying the hunt. Walking deeper into the antique store was like rappelling down a ravine. Every few feet, a new strata of time was revealed. The only thing that troubled me was that I had been there for an hour, and I still hadn't found the back wall of the antique shop. Not only had I not found the back wall, but I hadn't turned or moved out of the single aisle for quite some time. It was like one particular path had been built for the customers to move through, so slim that if one wanted to move in front of another, they would literally have to climb on top of each other. If I was claustrophobic, I might have had to turn back. I suppose that was why they called it Narrow Street Antiques. I had an old toy truck in my hands when I first saw it. I was considering the fact that perhaps Bob wasn't actually out in the shop, that Nora had been mistaken, that I was in the wrong place. It was during this thought that it happened. There in the very corner of my eye, just for a moment, A flash of something dark and quick. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing. I didn't think much of it. Then I turned my head again, back towards the front. There, blocking the only path forward, was a huge shape. It was dark, foreboding, and utterly terrible. It wasn't a person, necessarily. It was like a heavy blanket had been draped over a set of suits, and a bowling hat had been placed at the top. Flies buzzed around its head, or what I assumed was its head, and the scent of decay and death wafted towards me in a powerful wave. There were a few times in my life when I had felt pure, unfiltered dread such as this. I stood completely still, and the figure did the same. Except there was movement beneath its sheet. Small, shifting, as though the entire shape was vibrating. Then through a little ring-sized hole in the front of the sheet, something came out. A tiny, pink and plump child's finger. My breathing was shallow as the finger pointed at me. Then the entire figure lurched forward, swaying as though the top was not attached to the bottom. I was still stuck in my fear-driven paralysis. It got closer and my eyes watered from the wretched smell. It was like my feet were incapable of running back down the slight path and out the door. The buzzing of the flies got louder and louder. I shut my eyes. And then it stopped. I opened them again to see that the creature was gone. Not even a fly remained. I was shaking violently. I didn't need Bob this badly. I raised a foot to turn back and it refused to budge. It was like some invisible barrier existed between myself and the back half of the path. Frightened at the prospect of being stuck in this spot to wait for the creature to return, I tried to step forward. It was as easy as it had ever been. The message was clear. There was no choice but to continue. I can't be certain, but I believe 3 days passed in the antique store until I saw the creature again. It's hard to be sure of the time because as far as I can tell, the shop never closed. The lights overhead never shut off. I didn't hear the door at the front open or close either, but that could be because I had traveled a great distance from there to here. It was strange. I didn't feel hungry or thirsty, and I never had to use the bathroom. I didn't need to sleep. I would think I was exaggerating the time had about 3 days' worth of stubble not sprouted from my chin. I was somewhere in the 1940s when I thought I saw Bob. Amid a slew of war memorabilia and faded postcards, I saw it. Something like a light pink arm sticking out amongst some other worn, stuffed animals. I grabbed onto it, pulling eagerly. Nora had told me, albeit multiple days prior, that if I found Bob, I could bring him back to the register. I had to hold on to the hope that once I found what I was looking for, I'd be able to leave the shop. I yanked it loose. But it wasn't Bob. Instead, in my hand, I held a tiny child's finger. Immediately, I dropped it to the ground, feeling that familiar rush of anger that often accompanies a terrifying response. It bounced once on the surface before lying still. A tiny Vienna sausage. I stared at it. That feeling of hope when I had first thought I found what I was looking for was extinguished, and instead a crushing feeling of hopelessness and despair filled me. I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I couldn't find my way out. I was lost. As soon as I had that thought, I jumped back. The finger, which had been lying still, moved. It flipped so the nail was facing up towards me. Then, slowly, it began to inch its way along, continuing down the narrow path. I looked up at it, and there he was. He stood still, the antiquer. If he had eyes, I assumed they were fixed on me. We remained Me paralyzed by my immobile feet, and he waiting in place as the finger dragged itself along the floor over to him. I thought it might stop when it got to the edge of his shroud, but instead it merely crawled underneath. It joined the scattered movement that caused the material to jolt around, and then I saw it again. The child's finger emerged from the hole in the shroud and pointed at me. It was happening all over again. The lurching movement towards me, the flies buzzing around, some hitting my face in the flurry. The smell nearly made me vomit. Perhaps I would have if I could move. But the only thing there was to do was to watch the figure approach. I didn't shut my eyes this time. I watched as it reached a close distance, about 6 inches in front of me. Then it bent at the middle, the top swaying down over me. I felt hot breath and the cold sweat that had broken out across my forehead. There was something in there, beneath the shadows, but I couldn't bring myself to lift my chin and see it for myself. And then it was gone. Another shudder rattled through my tired body. My eyes were watering from the acrid smell and from relief. My chest was heavy with a terrible uncertainty, and yet I was sure of 2 things. 1, I never wanted to see that thing again. And 2, the only place to go was onward. By my 2nd or 3rd week at Narrow Street Antiques, I thought I had found a way to keep the antiquer away. Thinking about it now, when my mind is less plagued with whatever influence the shop held over me during those weeks, it's hard to say whether or not I was right. But this was at least my working theory. The antiquer's looking for lost things, because that's what antiques are, right? Things unstuck in time. Items that have outgrown their usefulness, their relevancy. And so, their natural place is no longer at a singular object. An antique is meant to be picked up, dusted off, and added to a collection. And I think if I lost enough, the antiquer will add me to his. I was in the late 1800s by that point. The items around me growing more decayed and broken with each step I took. I had learned something new, something incredibly exciting. The path that I had been following, miles and miles on the same straight line through the seemingly endless shop, was not the only road available to me. My eyes had grown heavy and unfocused while I was trudging along, and my foot caught on the leg of a table. I stumbled, holding out my arm to catch my fall against a large wardrobe to my right, and when I did, it rocked ever so slightly. It created a gap in the wall of old knickknacks that surrounded me, like just for a moment. And through that crack, I could see it. A new path. Then the wardrobe fell back into place and it was gone. I heaved against the wardrobe, pressing my shoulder hard against its wooden surface. It was incredibly heavy, but at this point, multiple weeks, if not months, in the antique shop, I was determined as I had ever been. I nudged the bulky piece of furniture inch by inch until I created a crevice that was wide enough for me to slip through. The new path took my breath away. Not because it was beautiful, no, far from it. Because it was terrifying. They were baby dolls. Not modern ones either. These had to be from the 1700s, maybe even older, all made from cracked china, with faded red lips and black dot eyes. They were dressed in plain clothes, dresses, and gingham trousers. They weren't lined on shelves or sat up on tables. They made up the walls themselves. A sea of them on either side. And when I looked up, I could see they covered the ceiling as well. A tunnel forming that I couldn't see the end of. And when I looked closer, I could see it. Something strange, even stranger than what I'd already seen. None of the dolls had their fingers. Absolute terror gripped me. 1,000 beady eyes staring at me, no sign of what I had come for. And though I tried to beat it back down, I was feeling more lost than ever. As soon as the inkling crossed my mind, there he was. The antiquer, standing still as he always was, blocking my path as he always did. I couldn't fight it this time. I couldn't reassure myself, couldn't look away, certainly couldn't turn back. I just watched the antiquer as he watched me, and then something started to happen. The shapes that writhed beneath his shroud began to rumble and shake. They moved faster and faster, and soon I saw something I wish I hadn't. The fingers, small and fleshy, began to crawl out from under the antiquer's shroud. They inched faster than the last one had, and as I watched, they did something remarkably horrible. Crawling like caterpillars, they each made their way to the hand of a doll. When the last one stopped, there was a moment of stillness. There were no more wriggling shapes under the antiquer's robes. We both stood facing one another. Then the last finger appeared, through the single hole in the shroud, and pointed at me. That was when the dolls began to close in. They spilled like water from a dam, in front of the walls and down from the ceiling, the only thing propelling them forward, the fleshy fingers on their dead porcelain hands. They dragged their little bodies across, and as they approached, I tried something desperate. I took the first step back that I had in weeks. After that step, another followed, and soon I was running back down the path, out from behind the wardrobe and back down the narrow path from where I'd come. Fleshy fingers and cold ceramic touched my shoulder for only a moment, but the small space that had led me into the doll hallway had slowed down the figures considerably. I was sprinting, my breath hard, and then I skidded to a stop. In front of me, fingers still pointed, suddenly was the antiquer. I looked to my left where a large shelf stood tall, lined with glass animal figures. With a single push, it crashed to the ground. I ran down this new hallway, lined with decorative kites from the 1800s. I ripped through their carefully preserved paper bodies and found myself in another new place, this time lined with novelty can openers from the 1920s. I glanced behind me as I dug through the metal bits, and I saw the first hints of their tiny porcelain children appearing down the long stretch as I found a path to somewhere new. 50s kitchen aprons, 60s false teeth, 70s record players, all with different discs playing in a minor key, and then, suddenly, there we were. 90s stuffed animals. It must have been, because there, between a giraffe with a ripped neck and a rabbit with a twisted ear, there was Bob. I grabbed him, the familiar jingle briefly bringing me nostalgic calm. I was running again, knowing that I was nearing the front of the store by the time traveling forward. I dug through the other stuffed animals, throwing them behind me with one hand while I clutched my prize with the other. Then there was the smallest opening and I could see it. The foyer, where all this had began weeks before. I stuck one foot through, then my shoulder. I went to step out and then something yanked me back, and I turned. One doll, the fastest of them, had clung onto Bob's arm, its fleshy fingers locked into an iron-tight grip. I pulled, it pulled. There was a long rip, the sound of stitches tearing, and then I was out. The only casualty being Bob's left arm. Stuffed animals fell together, closing the gap. It was as though there had never been an opening at all. I panted, my hands on my knees, my body disgusting with the buildup of sweat and fear on my skin. Welcome back. I looked up. There was Nora Vandeveld, standing in the same place she had been when I left her. In fact, she was even wearing the same clothes. And her sisters were still sitting in their rocking chairs, barely any progress made on their knitting since I had left. I moved my mouth, but no words came out. So long had it been since I spoke. Her eyes moved down to Bob and his mangled arm. Oh, it's a shame that it's been damaged. I know our shop is a precarious place. She smiled, slow and knowing. That one's on the house. I went home. To my great shock, it was a mere 30 minutes from when I had first entered the shop, despite the beard that had begun to form on my face and the tired feeling in my bones. There's still so much that I don't know about Narrow Street Antiques and the antiquer that lies within it. But sometimes, in the very corner of my eye, I can see it for a moment. A dark shape, vibrating with 1,000 tiny fingers, waiting patiently for me to lose my way again. Hey there, kids, and happy Halloween. It's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video, or listening to tonight's episode, this Oktoberfest, on the podcast. If you're not listening on the podcast, then you always can listen on the podcast at Spotify, or just about anywhere you find a podcast. And if you're not listening on YouTube, then you can find it on YouTube, or just about anywhere you find a YouTube. If any of you guys are interested in some of the audiobooks or actual books that have horror stories in them that I've worked on, you can always check out that description down below. In there's a couple of different links to some horror books and horror audiobooks and new things, like hopefully there'll be a Tales from the Gas Station Volume 3 link down there in the next few days, which I'm referring to right now, because if you look and it's out, it'll be there. Also, I wanted to say thank you all of you who are supporting me on Patreon. It's patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. If you ever want to help support the show, keep the lights on, feed my cats and the like, you can always head over to patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta, and you can support the show there. Even $1 is greatly appreciated. And I have a very special thank you to these guys, such as Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Mr. Thud, Ken Lando Higuchi, Chompski, Nico, kaeo, Tristain, Pelton, Stephen VanHuss, Chance Burnett, Deanna Kraus, G. Weevil 3, TheRedOakShieldVirus, CoryxKenshin, Pothead Holmes, Rival 1, JimboTheHutt, Caspian, Jordan Nells, The Village Witch, Hades' Nephew, Jordan Wayne Deckard, Bradley Leipe, and Charron, AcidSystem, Mike Bullock, Fooly Cooly Dude, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation, Brian Arse, Cryptic Nightmares, Shadow Morningstar, Brianna Wright, Someone You Love, Said the King 56, Bad Honey, S-Man, Kiri the Sloth, Thomas Burgett, Liam Newman, Sky Harbor, Caleb Dougal, Last Blade Song, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, and Aaron Stormcrow. And another thank you to all you guys who are in the description down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you all for listening. And I hope you all have a wonderfully happy Halloween. Sweet dreams.